I'm Gleaves Whitney. I direct the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley. And I welcome you to our Common Ground Summit, our summit for 2017 that we affectionately call Con Prague. Last year it was Prague Con. We're alternating year by year. And what I want to do is talk to you a little bit. We got too much reverb up here. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about why we're here. Great philosophical question with which to start any gathering, right? First, though, I do want to say thanks to the people who make events like this possible. We have a wonderful community in West Michigan that is civically engaged and generous with their gifts, and I'd like to single out the Kate and Richard Walters Foundation, the Progressive Women's Alliance of West Michigan, and the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal for all of the support that they provide to make events like this possible. You know, this is now, where have we come from? This is our fifth summit, our fifth Common Ground Summit, where we have really tried to tackle something important. And what I thought I would do a few brief moments before bringing up our speakers is tell you a little bit about where this comes from. It's really important to understand why we're committed to a Common Ground initiative at the Hauenstein Center. It starts with Ralph Hauenstein. Ralph Hauenstein just passed away about 16 months ago at the age of 103. He was 2 months short of his 104th birthday. Yeah, let's give him a hand. Give him a hand. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Ann. That's right. And it was through my many conversations with Ralph that a certain pattern began to emerge in his frustration with American democracy and the way things were going. This was a man who had seen the Great Depression. He had seen so much through World War II. Remember, Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein was somebody who was a colonel for Eisenhower. He was his chief of intelligence during D-Day. He was the first person to go into continental Europe as an officer. He was the first officer into occupied Paris as soon as the Nazis were cleared out, although he and Ernest Hemingway got in an argument about that. Ernest Hemingway said, "No, Colonel, or may I call you Ralph? I was the first one into Paris." To which Ralph said, "Ernie, you were so drunk, you don't know whether you were the first one in or not. Furthermore, you don't even know whether it was Paris or not where you ended up." Ralph was always the wit. But then Ralph, after touring Gestapo headquarters in Paris, he goes at this squad of men, and he's looking for SS leadership to prosecute, to capture, and they're going to bring him back to prosecute at Nuremberg. And he happens to a place north of Munich called Dachau. He's the first American into Dachau. And when Ralph would tell this story, you would just see him get this sort of self-control. You would see his jaw clench. He would say, when I walked in, and he wouldn't talk about this for 60 years. He only started talking about it really in the 90s. And he was in his 90s. And he said, you know, when I saw the stacks of bodies like cordwood, I knew that I would never be the same. And I said, well, Ralph, how did that eventuate in your wanting to found a Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies? And he said, I saw the greatest evil that human beings are capable of with my own eyes at places like Dachau. And when I walked out later that day, in 1945, I was determined to do everything I could to bring out the best in human beings. In our very flawed state that we're in, we can still do better than that. How do you stop totalitarianism? How do you stop a reign of terror? How do you reinforce the values that we Americans have had the privilege of growing up with? And so Ralph said, I want to do something with this Presidential Studies Center that enables the grandchildren of people yet unborn, to have the potential, the possibility to study the good things about this country, about our civilization, and that we're capable of doing as leaders and as good followers too. And Ralph said one day, he said, you know, I was part of the biggest common ground effort in human history. It was called D-Day. More than 22 countries, more than 5 million men and women coordinated to make that landing successful, to take back Fortress Europe. And Ralph was talking about that, and I thought, you know, we ought to do, Ralph, you just gave me marching orders. We ought to do something similar at the Hauenstein Center to honor this idea. Because if you can get General Montgomery and de Gaulle and Patton in the same room and get them to agree, then you could get any individuals to agree to do anything. But Eisenhower had a genius for getting people who had vastly different personalities, dramatically different agendas, to come together and agree to undertake something heroic. Now, we're not taking back Fortress Europe. We're not fighting a civil war. But I like to think that what we're doing at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies with our partners is something that honors Ralph's memory. That we can be better than what we have seen. We can do better as Americans. And that's why we've been committed to the Common Ground Initiative these past years. It's why with a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, we started this project starting in 2012. We've had 5 now of these summits, and we've had some amazing speakers over the years. We brought together, I think for the first time, Cornel West and Robbie George, 2 people teaching at Princeton, vastly different agendas. And not only was it, you know, a wonderfully warm presentation, it was just carried by C-SPAN, by the way. Not only was it a wonderfully warm presentation, just because of the human interchange between them, but it was substantive. You know, you would throw a controversial topic at them, and to watch them take the topic and frame the questions in such a way that they could communicate with each other. These 2 master teachers who come at their progressive tradition and their conservative tradition from very different points. But to watch them pull that together was inspiring. Again, go to C-SPAN. In fact, my wife, who was sitting in the audience for this thing, she said, she walked out of there, she said, "This is better than marriage counseling." It's just perfect. So anyway, I want us to do something heroic. We have selected 30 speakers from all over the United States. And we've chosen these speakers for a very particular reason. They're darn good at what they know. They're great writers. They're great teachers. They're committed. And they also have the temperament to try to search for that common ground. And just one last comment on this before I bring tonight's speakers forward. We're not talking about this rush toward the mushy middle, where you abandon principle, where you're just doing log rolling. No, that is not common ground at all. Common ground brings people together who are firmly rooted in their traditions. It's Russell Kirk meeting with Arthur Schlesinger, a conservative and a progressive, and their ability to search in a philosophical and through historical analogy ways that their traditions agree and disagree. We're interested in where the progressive is, where the progressive has sunk her roots into bedrock. And you're not going to move out of that. And where the conservative has sunk his roots into his bedrock. But there's a civic ecology on top of that bedrock. There's a humus, there's a rich soil. And when you have the growth on top, it's kind of this civic ecology where there's a mixing and mingling, and the plants support each other. That's where we want to be. We accept that people have their commitments in that bedrock. They go deep, and we honor that through their scholarship and their civic commitments. But we want people to go broad in the civic ecology, the public square. So we set the bar high at these summits. We want our speakers to give us their best from their commitments, their engagement, their deep scholarship. And I think over the next couple of days, we're going to have a great time. And I so appreciate your participation in being here with us. So with that, I'd like to have our two speakers come forward now and join me on stage, and we'll sit down here. Great. All right. Well, George Hawley is to my left. George Hawley is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Alabama. His research interests include demography, electoral behavior, political parties, immigration policy, and the conservative movement in America. His latest book, Right-Wing Critics of American Conservatism, was published by Kansas. And I've got to say, in our conversations leading up to tonight, that he has some other interesting things going on. First of all, he's got another book that's coming out that Columbia is going to publish on the alt-right. So that's, I think, going to be much explored because that's such an intense topic in our civil discourse right now. He comes at these things as a social scientist. And so here's somebody who of course, wanted to predict the 2016 election. He probably has the best record of anybody who is making the predictions. He predicted 48 of the 50 states in 2016, the Electoral College, how they'd go. Guess what one of the two states that he missed was? Right here in Michigan. Yeah. So welcome to Michigan. He hasn't, you know, I like to have speakers that keep our audiences a little bit off balance. He has actually not voted since 2006. And he only voted in 2006 because his mother guilted him into it. So welcome. We look forward to conversing with you tonight.
Thank you.
And then to my right, Daniel McCarthy. Daniel served more than 6 years as editor of the American Conservative, where he is now an editor at large. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, USA Today, The Spectator, The National Interest, Reason, Modern Age, and many other publications. Outside of journalism, he has worked as Internet Communications Coordinator for the Ron Paul 2008 presidential campaign and as Senior Editor of ISI Books. He is a graduate of Washington U in St. Louis, where he studied classics. Now, you're probably thinking you've got him totally figured out, but you don't. Guess who he voted for in the Virginia primary? Bernie Sanders. So you're going to have somebody in Dan who's going to keep you a little bit off balance as well. That's what's going to make this conversation, I think, really interesting. So with that, I'd like to start with the first question. We'll go through a few questions, and at a certain point, when it's natural to have a break, we'd like to invite you to come forward and put your own questions, since we have such spectacular expertise of the current events that we've been facing. And we all have questions. And I think I'd like to start with a quotation from John Meacham, one of our colleagues in the presidential studies field. "This is a remarkable and indeed unprecedented moment in American history," writes Meacham. "Donald Trump is a unique figure, one whose presidency will shape the nation and the world for generations. What does he know? What does he think? How does he make decisions? What does the past tell us? These are key, urgent, consuming questions." Well, let's just start by saying, who is Donald Trump?
I guess I'd start by saying what he isn't, and he is not an ideologically committed conservative, for better or for worse. If we were trying to put a label on him that I think fits, I think that the sort of catch-all term right-wing populist is accurate. But unfortunately, that doesn't have a lot of predictive power in terms of what sort of policies one will promote, given that populism is not a particularly constraining ideology. But I do think it is accurate, at least looking over Trump's political statements going back to the 90s.
Okay, very good. Dan, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, you know, I too will describe Trump in negative terms. Negative, that is, in terms of what he is not. He is not as dramatic a break with the past as we might imagine. And it seems to me that since the end of the Cold War, we've seen an evolution and a change in the presidency. We've seen that our presidents have sort of lighter and lighter resumes and less experience in governing as they come into power. So, you know, at the end of the Cold War, we had George H.W. Bush as president. And this was a man who had served as vice president before entering the Oval Office. This was a man who had served in the House of Representatives, who had been the director of the CIA. He was succeeded by two governors, by Bill Clinton and by his son, George W. Bush. And even there was a little bit of a diminution in terms of how much experience they had, because, well, both of them had served 2 terms as governors. Clinton had a rather powerful governorship in Arkansas, whereas, as you know, the Texas governorship is relatively weak. So even there, I think you saw something of a diminution that, you know, George W. Bush was also someone who had been a baseball manager and had some other, you know, sort of sidelights outside of politics. And it's also interesting as well that both of those individuals were voted in as contrast to Washington, D.C. That, you know, Bill Clinton was seen as being a kind of a populist back in 1992, in contrast to George H.W. Bush, who was imagined to be out of touch. And similarly, in 2000, George W. Bush was seen as being a kind of Texan, Middle American kind of person, in contrast to the sitting vice president that he was running against, Al Gore. Well then, with the 2 presidencies we've had since George W. Bush, with Barack Obama and now with Donald Trump, you've had even less experience. And again, they've both been outsider candidates. That Barack Obama had been you know, senator for a single term, and that was the limit of his experience in national politics. He had never been a governor. He didn't really have a sense of executive power as he became president. And I think that actually showed through in his terms as the commander-in-chief. And then with Donald Trump now, we have someone who has absolutely no political experience whatsoever prior to becoming president of the US. So in some ways, Donald Trump is a kind of dramatic development. But in other ways, I think he shows that the American people have been progressively losing confidence, losing faith in the political leadership and the institutions that craft political leadership in our country. So Trump is, in some ways, a continuity. He's also a continuity, I think, with Barack Obama, in that both of them are candidates who represent the idea of change. With Barack Obama, it was hope and change. And with Donald Trump, I think it was the sense that Obama had failed to deliver change, that he was not radical enough, which is perhaps why you saw even, you know, in certain places in the Midwest, voters who had voted for Barack Obama twice switched their votes and voted for Donald Trump in this election. So that's my general take on Trump, that there's something here which transcends the man himself and in fact speaks to the way in which both the presidency and the American Republic is developing.
Well, that actually segues into the next question. If you look at the title of our opening discussion, it's Intellectuals and Trump, Understanding Our Disruptive Moment. So I would ask us to ponder a little bit this word disruptive. I mean, it seems that Donald Trump and the populism that we see today has been disruptive on a number of different levels. First of all, the Republican Party has been very disrupted. The establishments of both parties have been disrupted. The conservative movement has been disrupted. And America has been disrupted. But how disrupted? I mean, let's try to qualify or get our arms around this idea of disruption.
Well, I mean, you're talking about 3 different distinct groups being disrupted: the conservative movement, the GOP, and American society. I think when we think about going through those one at a time, the conservative movement's problem with Trump is really what he revealed about that movement. That is, that it really is not a mass movement. If you look through voter preferences, if you go to things like the American National Election Survey, et cetera, and say, okay, what are people's policy preferences? You'll see that outside in the electorate, even people who call themselves strong Republicans, even people who think of themselves as being conservatives, are not consistent conservatives when it comes to policy. You will find shockingly few people in the electorate who possess anything resembling true ideological constraints. And so the conservative movement has maintained this tremendous amount of control over the GOP because of this myth that the American voters, particularly Republican primary voters, care a lot about conservatism as such. And Donald Trump demonstrated that that was absolutely not true. He was able to violate so many conservative principles throughout the campaign, and every time he did so, conservative media said he was finished. And he turned out to either be strengthened by it or for it to have no effect. And so now that the conservative movement has been proven to be toothless, I think that is a realization that is not going to be forgotten. In terms of the Republican Party, it's hard to say what the long-term disruption will be. I think he definitely surprised them by handing them a victory they were not expecting. I think that the fact they didn't expect it showed in the fact that they did not have a health care bill that they were ready to vote on, despite supposedly having a better part of a decade to work on it, means that they did not really expect to win this time. And also seeing that, okay, well, they had a particular playbook that they had wanted to work from, and it turns out that a totally different strategy was what actually handed them the White House. So there will be those who would like to go back to the Romney style, which lost, and those who will try to build on Trumpism. And it remains to be seen which of those is going to win out in the long run. In terms of American society, I think it's less so much Trump's policies, at least at this point, that have proven disruptive than so much Trump the man or what Trump represents. Trump, in a way, whether he intended to or not, does represent a kind of reemergence of white identity politics, even if that was not the intention of his campaign. That was certainly led to a growth in that type of political discourse in the United States. Whether or not that ultimately gets bottled up again, I think remains too early to be seen.
Dan. Well, you know, George has covered those bases so thoroughly that all I can do is kind of add a gloss. I think that one thing that Trump has disrupted, at least as dramatically as, say, Uber has disrupted the taxi industry, is the science of campaigning. That Donald Trump really showed that this very sort of focus group driven, technologically savvy, quasi-scientific approach to running campaigns was fraudulent. That in fact, Donald Trump made a very visceral appeal to the public. He told them what he believed. He wasn't worried about whether or not it was checking off the right boxes, whether or not it had been focus grouped, whether or not it was even within the realm of conservative orthodoxy. He simply said things. He gauged the reaction he received. He certainly was a dynamic candidate. He didn't simply stick to one point and then stay with it no matter what. He did shift and change over the course of the campaign. But he did this in a kind of honest, forthright, old-fashioned way. He did it as if he were, you know, a kind of soapbox speaker or, you know, a 19th century political candidate, as opposed to one who was taking lessons from a Karl Rove, so to speak, or any number of other very high-paid consultants. So that was a profound change in our politics. I think what Trump showed is that almost the politics of sincerity, or at least the politics of emotional direct appeal, counts for a lot more in democracy than our technocratic elites had really realized that it did. And that in fact, trying to manage people, having a sort of managerial approach to elections, having this idea that if you just know what the numbers are, you'll be able to sort of control and manage and manipulate people, proved to be incorrect. And I think Americans should see that as a very liberating thing. They should see that as sort of being disruptive of some of the chains that they themselves have been subject to, whether or not they like Donald Trump. I think that progressives, for example, should look at this and say, we don't have to settle for a Hillary Clinton. Maybe we don't even have to settle for the choices of the two parties, although that I think is a much harder network to disrupt. So I very much agree with all that George has said, and I would simply add that in so many other ways there has been this dramatic disruption. And then I would just add, sort of in conclusion, that the one thing I worry has not been disrupted is the way that Washington does business. And I think that you know, it's well known in Washington that Donald Trump is having a great deal of difficulty draining the swamp, as he had promised to. That we still see lobbyists, basically, even though there is a number of regulations and even some bans on certain kinds of lobbyists serving in government, the new administration offers a lot of waivers. So that's kind of undermining the whole point of draining the swamp. So I do worry that even though Trump has changed politics in so many ways, that certain fundamental bad habits, which have been ingrained in DC for so long now, may continue.
Both of your answers point to something, and we can, I think all of us agree in this room that politics, the study of economics, are downstream from the culture, that ultimately you've got to look at the culture that produces this kind of politics and economic and social thinking. Let me just ask you, what do you think Trump means in terms of the changes in American culture?
I'll go ahead and defer to Dan on that one first. I'll have to think about that for a second.
Okay.
Yeah, again, I would relate the changes in American culture. Obviously, this is someone who, in addition to having been a successful real estate entrepreneur, is perhaps best known as a brand, and is perhaps best known for being a reality TV star on The Apprentice. So there certainly is a change in American culture there in terms of perhaps who Americans look up to, that they no longer look up to someone who has a long record of service in public office. They now look up to someone who is seen to speak for them in a reality TV context. So perhaps we've seen some developments in terms of really the trust and the ability of the American public to relate to different kinds of public figures, whether they're celebrities or whether they are people who, in years past, would have been considered authorities, moral authorities. And it seems to me that blaming Trump for that would be a mistake, or blaming the public also would be a mistake. That the reason we have this crisis of legitimacy and this crisis of authority among the more credentialed experts and elites in this country is because they have governed us badly. And that kind of bad government, whether it comes to economic policies that lead us to the Great Recession, whether it's referring to foreign policy that leads us into the Iraq War and into a number of Middle East crises that seem to be irresolvable, that the aggregate effect of all of this has been to disillusion the American people with the old ways of judging authority and the old kind of deference and respect they felt towards institutions and individuals. And as a result, they're looking for some substitute, some alternative. And our popular culture supplies a substitute and supplies an alternative. And that alternative, obviously, is the celebrity culture and this idea of sort of identifying with people you see on TV or identifying with people you see on Twitter, and being part of this sort of direct sort of crowd effect or tribe, as some people would like to say, and engaging in sort of direct combat about interests. And it's seeing politics as that kind of forthright clash of different views and different perspectives. So that's the overview I would give of Donald Trump's effect, or Donald Trump's correspondence to the changes in American culture.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all of that. And certainly there's this broader trend of a weakening of traditional sources of authority, of people not trusting, the religious institutions, the media institutions, government institutions, just a general mistrust of all of them. And then of those who do trust specific individuals and institutions, there's not a uniform society-wide source of authority. People will look towards different things that they will say, okay, this is a reliable source of information, whereas another source is not. And so people are, I think, going into their own cocoons of information and trust, which I think is potentially problematic in the long run.
And one of the reasons I'm interested, George, in your perspective on this is the book that you're working on now, about the alt-right. I mean, there's a cultural nexus there that must be interesting that you're discovering too between Trump and the alt-right.
I mean, certainly where you see people who are literally getting all of their information off of places like 4chan and treating that as gospel, where it is very easy for misinformation to be spreading quite rapidly and be able to be disseminated without any sort of filter. I mean, whatever one thinks about the older model of communication, where there were these monopolies, sort of the big three networks, and then even once you move to cable news, there was at least some degree of accountability and responsibility in terms of what information was conveyed to the public. That has largely gone away. I don't really care for the term fake news, but I think we are definitely seeing, I think that is something that is worth paying attention to and watching in the years ahead.
Well, again, your comments are so good that there's so many things I want to ask at once here. And I guess the question I have is how are the changes that we've seen in the politics changing American intellectual life, for example? Would you care to address that?
Well, it's had a tremendously invigorating effect on the intellectual life of conservatives. So you've seen a remarkable efflorescence now of new institutions, new journals, new websites. And that ranges all the way from the rather popular populist approach of something like Breitbart, for example, which, I mean, Breitbart is, comes in for a lot of criticism. It's a very controversial site. But in fact, it's a site that has added a lot of expertise recently. They hired John Carney, for example, who is one of the best people at the Wall Street Journal. They hired, a number of foreign policy reporters and others who are highly respected, even within the old, traditional media. So they're a very entrepreneurial organization, and you can see a real liveliness and energy to an institution like Breitbart that you just did not see in the conservative movement about 10 years ago. But even older institutions have been revived right now. So National Review, I think, is undergoing a bit of a renaissance. They've just hired my former colleague, Michael Brendan Doherty, who's a fantastic writer, and who is a American conservative magazine-style conservative. That is someone who is a kind of cultural traditionalist, but also has been very critical of Republican foreign policy and has a certain favorable perspective on economic nationalism. So that's a perspective I think you would not have seen at National Review just a few years ago, but which now is going to have a very powerful voice. And then again, to speak of another sort of new institution that has sprung up, I've been impressed by this new journal, a quarterly called American Affairs, which is an intellectual journal that represents sort of some of the creme de la creme of the Trump movement's thought. So even though I think a lot of people from the outside, a lot of progressives and even people in the center, would look at conservatism right now and say, well, Trump seems like a dumbing down of things. They would look at perhaps Breitbart or Infonews or fake news, and they'd say, oh, all of this is clearly a sign that the conservative mind has, lost its mind. But actually, there's an enormous amount of intellectual ferment going on here. And what I would like to see, in fact, is this degree of creativity break out on the left as well, and perhaps in the center too. And in the center, to kind of bring things back together. On the left, to respond to Trump not just in an ad hominem way, not just in a way that says this is ghastly, this is horrible, but in a way that says theoretically, how did we come to this point? Why is it that we wound up with Donald Trump in the White House? And what are the larger forces that are responsible for putting him there? It seems to me that that kind of depth would be very helpful for America's public discourse in general. And I've been a little disappointed so far that I think progressives have not really delved into that as much as they should, and that certainly, much of what you see on a regular basis is a kind of superficial and personal abhorrence of Donald Trump.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that I've been observing about conservative intellectuals, especially those that have sort of come around to Trump over the last couple of months, is in a way almost like trying to work backwards and trying to build a coherent ideology around Trumpism when Trumpism really didn't have much of a philosophical intellectual foundation to begin with. And I think I sense a little bit of that in American Affairs and in places like the Journal for American Greatness, et cetera, of almost going the opposite route of, say, the way the conservative movement developed, where it started with the ideas and with the activist groups and with Barry Goldwater's unsuccessful campaign, and only down the line did they finally win the presidency. It seems like Trumpism won first, and only now are intellectuals trying to make sense of what that actually means. So I'll be curious to watch that over the next couple of years as well.
Well, Dan, you mentioned it, and I think you can go there very easily as well. This seems like a wonderful opportunity if you're a progressive to say, look, we have nothing to lose. I mean, we need to get more power in the House and the Senate. We need to take the White House back. We need to make a lot better progress out in the states where we've lost hundreds and hundreds of elected positions in the state houses over the last 8 to 10 years. So what should progressives be doing at this juncture? How should they be responding? You touched on sort of the ad hominem nature of a lot of this right now, but isn't there an amazing opportunity?
Yeah, I think there should be. But I mean, it can be very difficult. It can be very difficult to be in opposition. And I think the worst thing that happened to the conservative mind was not Donald Trump, certainly. Quite the contrary. I think Trump has been very healthy for it. The worst thing that happens to conservatives is when you have a Democrat in the White House and conservatism gets redefined as simply being anti-Bill Clinton or anti-Barack Obama. And the danger that progressives are facing right now is that they are simply going to be anti-Donald Trump. They're not going to stand for anything, or that even the principles they do stand for are going to be sort of watered down and simply communicated as being in reference to Donald Trump as opposed to being in and of themselves. So I think progressives right now should be doing a lot of thinking about Bernie Sanders, for example. And you know, Gleaves had mentioned that I did vote for Sanders in the Democratic primary in Virginia. I did that because you know, there were certain issues that Donald Trump had been talking about up to that point, which I thought were completely beyond the pale. One of those being Donald Trump at the time was supporting torture, which is something that I would not vote for. The other thing being, I thought that, you know, Sanders brings a very interesting perspective to our politics, and you know, he's disruptive in a good way. And yeah, actually, if you somehow wound up with President Sanders, Sanders plus a Republican Congress gives you actually kind of a positive and nice gridlock. You'd have a very peaceful foreign policy, I think, and very little would happen on the domestic side because of Congress. So that appealed to my libertarian side. It's sort of the ne plus ultra of divided government. But yeah, I think progressives should be looking at you know, what the philosophical divide between Hillary Clinton and what she stood for, and Bernie Sanders and what he stood for, what that means for their movement, and continue to have kind of an honest and open debate, let their differences come out. That was something the right always made a mistake with, that they always tried to say, well, you know, we're just going to oppose Clinton or oppose Obama. We don't want to talk about the differences between our traditionalists and our libertarians and, you know, kind of national greatness versus states' rights and so forth. And whenever conservatives did that, they sometimes, you know, sort of won elections here and there, but they lost their sense of mission, their sense of purpose, and their sense of honesty as well, and their integrity. So I would actually caution the progressives against that. I would say, even if there's some political anxiety or difficulty in having these debates between the Clinton and Sanders sources, nevertheless, that's healthy and that should happen.
Is this a great moment for progressives?
Well, it could potentially be. I mean, in the sense that, you know, without having to actually make policy, you know, you have freedom to develop ideas without having to have them tested. When I think about what ails the progressive movement, though, I think there has been an unfortunate sense of inevitability, I think, among a lot of progressive thinkers. That is, when we think about, say, when the emerging Democratic majority came out in 2002 by Judas and Teixeira, said, like, look at the demographics. This is the way things are going. If we just wait it out, we are going to be in charge. And, you know, it has now been a decade and a half since then, and this permanent progressive majority has not yet emerged, yet there is still this sense that, well, we're owed to it because we have this growing demographic base, and I think there has not been enough sort of internal soul-searching because there's a sense that, well, don't worry, the new immigrant populations, the young people, the new professionals, they're going to just hand us victory and we're not going to have to earn it. I think that if that mindset can be overcome, I think it will be a great boon to the progressive movement going forward.
I'd like to invite the audience to come forward and ask questions. I'd like to see lines on both sides here form. I'm sure you have many things you'd like to put to our very perceptive speakers here. And while people are gathering, well, we've got somebody right away. Please, yes, Nicole?
Well, I just had a question. I'm Nicole Hemmer. I'm from the Miller Center. And as a scholar of conservatism and as a writer on contemporary events, I've found my language sort of shifting in the last year to 18 months, where I used to describe things as conservative, and I've moved to that language of right or right wing. And I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about this moment and how you distinguish between conservative and right wing. And Dan, especially for you, paleoconservative. What do you think of that term? Because you could fit at least part of Donald Trump's policies into a Pat Buchanan paleoconservative, maybe even American conservative tradition. And is that still part of the conservative movement? So is the conservative movement toothless, or is it just a broader church than we thought it was?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think the distinction between conservatism and the right is of critical importance nowadays. I gave a talk at DePaul University shortly before the election, and I made that the theme of my talk. And I have a very short piece, I think forthcoming in The Week, the online publication, which will discuss this. It's a very brief piece, but it gets to the point. Conservatism, I think, just as a useful term, often refers to the sort of checklist of policies, the sort of fusionist idea of bringing together, a certain amount of family values, a certain amount of traditionalism, with a libertarian economic program and perhaps a strong, sort of activist foreign policy. And this kind of checklist conservatism is what most of the institutions of conservatism in Washington, D.C., for example, it's what they stand for, it's the program they propound, it's what you typically were getting from the Heritage Foundation, for example, and from magazines ranging from National Review to the Weekly Standard and so forth. So it's the programmatic approach, the checklist approach, is what I call conservatism in this context. There are other contexts in which I might use the word conservatism in different ways, but I think that's the one in which it's most salient in terms of contemporary politics. Now, the right, I think, is something very different, whereas conservatism is a kind of an intellectual or quasi-intellectual ideological construct, a set of policies, and an ideology or philosophy that justifies those policies. The right is something visceral, and the right is something much more emotional, and it's a response. It's a sense of us versus them. And so it seems to me Donald Trump is a vindication of the right against the formulaic, programmatic conservatism that the institutions of conservatism had stood for. And I think if you actually apply this framework backwards, you kind of develop an interesting set of insights into past Republican presidents. So for example, in someone like Richard Nixon, he clearly was not a conservative in the programmatic sense. He implemented wage and price controls that conservatives hated. He reached out to China in a way that conservatives hated. In any number of ways, he, like Donald Trump, basically disregarded the orthodoxies of conservatism as an ideology. Nevertheless, I think we would be very mistaken if we did not describe Donald Trump as being a quite right-wing president, and a president who certainly did appeal to voters from the right. And I think that was the absolute essence, in fact, of Donald Trump's, sorry, not Donald Trump, but of Richard Nixon's appeal and success and his victory in 1972. And by the way, one of the people who understands this best, and basically the person from whom I have derived that understanding of Nixon, is Pat Buchanan, who is, as Nicole had mentioned, sort of the figure that is most popularly identified with this idea of paleoconservatism. I think paleoconservatism had an understanding of the right that movement conservatism, the sort of Beltway DC-centered conservatism, lost its sense of. Paleoconservatism, it tended to focus on issues such as protectionism as opposed to free trade, an America First foreign policy as opposed to a sort of activist foreign policy in the world. And paleoconservatism also tended to be very restrictionist when it came to immigration. So in all those respects, it sounds exactly like the Donald Trump program. And you might think that there is a direct connection between what Pat Buchanan was saying on the campaign trail in 1992 and 1996 and what you've seen from Donald Trump last year. That said, however, paleoconservatism did have other dimensions that I think are completely absent from the Donald Trump phenomenon. So paleoconservatism tended to have a very deep appreciation of literature and of culture. It tended to be very much invested in localism and sort of particular community. And it always had this decentralist and devolutionary impulse. There was a tension in paleoconservatism between certain kinds of nationalism and certain kinds of localism and decentralism. And in fact, you would often have intense debates in the pages of, for example, Chronicles magazine, which in the 1990s was the premier paleoconservative magazine. You'd have these debates between the more nationalist paleoconservatives and the more localist, oftentimes quasi-agrarian paleoconservatives. So Donald Trump, I think, you can see there is a parallel to paleoconservatism, but I think he is kind of a new development, and he maybe draws a little bit upon the past. He has talked to Pat Buchanan, I know, but I think he also takes some of the themes that paleoconservatism had taken in the past and really takes them in a very different direction, a new direction, and has taken them into power, which is again something that paleoconservatives never got close to in the past. And it's something that now raises a lot of questions as to how do you actually implement so many of these themes that Buchanan had talked about in the 90s, that Trump talked about last year, which have not been guiding policy decisions in Washington for many, many years, if ever.
Yeah, I would agree with most of that. And I will also state I've spent a lot of time thinking about our use of these terms. It was a big theme in my last book of trying to think this stuff through. And, you know, when we think about the political terms that are most prevalent in the United States, we have a couple of problems. I mean, obviously on the left we have the problem with the definition of liberalism, obviously. That's probably one that is even more commonly debated, and especially libertarians who are very angry about their word being appropriated. But on the right, the problem I see it with is that leaving aside the conservative movement, which is the three-legged stool of strong national defense, traditional family values, and economic quasi-libertarianism, conservatism itself, I would say, I would be willing to describe it as being context dependent. And, you know, conservatives as important as, say, Robert Nisbet would agree with that, saying, you know, if you were a communist in the Soviet Union in 1991, then you were, in a sense, a conservative. Whereas if you were a czarist in Russia in 1916, you would have also been a conservative. And so that's problematic. And the right is also a problem as a term, because in my view, the right can really only be described in the negative. I think that the left can be accurately described as being a catch-all term for all of those ideological movements that place equality as sort of the guiding light, as their North Star, as the thing that they're aiming towards. Whereas the right, I would argue, is much more heterogeneous and would encompass all of those ideologies that favor something beyond equality, as putting something else above equality in its hierarchy of values, and will fight the left when it is at odds with, when their beliefs are at odds with equality. And in that sense, I think Donald Trump most definitely is right-wing. I don't think that universal equality is something that he views as being a major goal of his. I don't think that's a controversial statement. But on the other hand, I don't know, and I would say he is, in a way, conservative in the generic sense, though. You know, he is not in favor of radical change, for example. I don't think he is the radical that many on the left and right have described him as. So anyway, that's my answer to your question about semantics today.
I would just say, I mean, capitalism, free market economy, is in a sense the most radical material force ever unleashed. I mean, in that sense, to the extent that he embraces that entrepreneurial instinct, you know, this is what has remade our cities. I mean, it's in that sense, it's a very radically altering ideology. Just a thought. Chuck, and then we'll go to you. Okay, you're a gentleman. Yes, please.
Thanks. My name's Martha Jones. I'm from the University of Michigan. I think I want to pick up on precisely your intervention, because listening, part of my sense is that progressive, conservative, but really political analysis and a political framework doesn't seem to sort of do justice or, for me, wholly explain either the rise of or the ideas of Mr. Trump even today. And I guess I wanted to ask you if, in fact, we need to think beyond political terms to understand the world out of which Mr. Trump came, which was, yes, New York politics, but also New York real estate development and speculation, or the companion rise of journalist moguls like Michael Bloomberg. And so there seems to me a sense that sort of this language and this analysis is not quite adequate, and I want to understand how it is that something as powerful a force as real estate development and its autonomy in politics in a place like New York, or journalism, what do we need? What else do we need in order to fully explain and understand this moment?
I think my question is the system, the rules of the game. What has exacerbated this division? And what is the things that are producing this? For example, the populist vote doesn't count. Lobbyists are rampant. you have vested interest money running into this whole system. What these factors seem to be contributing, and you've alluded to them, but I wonder if the rules of the game or the system, the political system, and I would include the ignorance of the American public and being conned on both parties, because both parties have value to offer, and it seems like they could meet a common ground if they didn't have this polarization. What is it in the system that causes this polarization?
Well, there's a lot there. Who wants to start?
I guess in response to the first question, maybe you'll be able to clarify a few things for me. So you think we should be introducing new terms? I think
Perhaps,
you're right.
but I really
right.
new frameworks,
Yeah,
right?
I think
politics doesn't
yeah.
account for wholly. I don't think.
Well, I mean, to say that politics doesn't account for it wholly, I think that's right. But in terms of how we describe it, I think it's also a valid point that if we're using sort of out-of-date terminology, that can be clouding our understanding as much as clarifying it. Unfortunately, introducing new terms into the political lexicon is a bit of a challenge, and one I'm not up to just right at this moment. I don't know if...
Yeah, I think I'll try to relate those two questions. I agree that Donald Trump's background, both as a matter of geography and culture, that New York has a particular way of doing things, a particular way of looking at, for example, relations between ethnicities in politics, that is very different from what you find in different places. That's very significant, and that helps to explain some of the combativeness of Trump, but also perhaps why Trump is not necessarily, that just because he criticizes a group of people doesn't mean he necessarily hates them. He's used to a kind of very rough and tumble political culture in New York that you don't necessarily have in many other places. And to other places it looks like this is just, this is pure Klan stuff, this is pure, insane bigotry. So there's that element which I think needs to be brought out. The economic, and not just the economic, but the psychological dimension corresponding to economics when it comes to something like real estate deals. That too has to be factored into an understanding of Donald Trump, an understanding, and also the sort of contrast between the way Trump approaches politics as someone who has a background in real estate, as someone who has a background in certain kinds of negotiation, versus the way in which, the very formalized and mannered way in which Washington, D.C. is accustomed to dealing in politics. So that again is perhaps a disruption. There's been a disruption of a certain kind of mannerism that, or a formalism that had applied in Washington, D.C. And all of this only scratches the surface. I mean, there's so much more that applies to that. And even going back to the previous question about Trump and the paleoconservatives, this too is a major distinction. The paleoconservatives tended to see themselves as having, ties to the Midwest, ties to the South. They saw themselves very much as not being a kind of urban movement and not having much to say about a place like New York City, for example. Donald Trump clearly is very much, New York is in his blood, and that's part of his phenomenon. It's quite different from paleoconservatism. In terms of the question about the system, I think it would be quite right to say that the terms of left and right, conservative, progressive, these are inadequate. This is inadequate language with which to describe the system as a whole, that there are dimensions to it in economics and in terms of sociology which simply are not covered by these ideological frameworks. And one of the things that I think is very encouraging right now is that you're seeing, especially among conservatives and people on the right, an attempt to create a new language, an attempt to rediscover frameworks that describe our social phenomena in ways that are not simply hackneyed liberal, conservative, progressive, left-wing, right-wing frameworks. So, for example, the work of James Burnham, who was a long-time sort of Trotsky sympathizer and Marxist, who by the 1940s had become soured on Trotsky and Marx, and tried to develop a new framework for describing the American economy of the time, which he called the managerial revolution. Burnham was someone who was very influential back in the 40s, who then later on in the 1950s actually becomes closely aligned with the conservative movement. He becomes one of the founding senior editors of National Review. I've been very encouraged to see, however, that within the last few years, a number of very interesting young writers on the right or among conservatives have started to rediscover Burnham, and not just rediscover Burnham as a Cold Warrior and as a conservative figure, but to rediscover Burnham as a theorist of class, a theorist of power, even outside of the categories of left and right or conservative and progressive. In some ways, Burnham tries to create a Marxism without Marx. And Burnham also later adds a number of Machiavellian sociologists and social thinkers, so for example, Pareto, Roberto Michels, Gaetano Mosca, etc. These are social thinkers who did not just, put their ideas into a simple left-right framework. They were real sociologists. They were real theorists of society and of the relationship between power as a phenomenon and economics as a phenomenon. For example, I mentioned American Affairs. One of the lead essays in the first issue of that journal by the journal's editor, Julius Krein, is about James Burnham and the managerial revolution. I myself have been, sort of re-examining and rediscovering Burnham over the past, 5 years or so, and have written a number of pieces for the American Conservative about him. And so have a number of other writers. Matthew Continetti, for example, who's the editor of the Washington Free Beacon, has also been sort of a new convert to Burnhamism. So I think that the system is starting to be described by people, certainly on the right. My hope is that parallel developments are happening on the left. The system is being described in ways that are not simply hackneyed political bipolarities, but they're actually trying to describe the fundamental powers in economics and in politics that drive the way the system as a whole works.
One last thing to add on that. I don't want to keep everything on the same questions, but I think one thing that does lead to a greater amount of confusion about what's going on is we use the term liberal and democracy, or liberal Democrat, in the small d sense so frequently that we tend to conflate the two. And one thing that's worth noting is this managerial elite, I think, would universally describe, not universally, but close to universally describe themselves as being good liberals or good progressives, but their power is not really democratic. That's not really the source of their authority. And on the other hand, you have somebody like Trump who is, populism is most definitely democratic, but it's not particularly liberal in either sense of the word. So I think we need to do a better job of disentangling these two things, an institution being democratic versus being liberal, and not assuming that because something is one, it must necessarily be the other.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Yes, please.
Hey, I'm Andy. I teach statistics here part-time. The Jackson Civil War comments, the wiretapping comments, his seemingly absent knowledge about his own healthcare bill concerned me, and it really reminds me of Richard Hofstadter's 1963 book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And I would just like to hear your take on what I perceive as a seemingly pronounced growth of anti-intellectualism in the American populace in the Trump era.
Well, I forget who had said it, but one of the more perceptive remarks during the campaign, during its latter phase, was that Trump's supporters take him seriously but not literally, and that Trump's detractors take him literally but not seriously. Now, even that remark itself probably has to be taken seriously but not literally, because it's all a very complicated phenomenon. So when we look at some of the things that Trump says which are factually incorrect and which in some cases are very sort of far-fetched to the immediate eye and that are clearly not correct, on the one hand, there's a certain emotional truth to them which I think should be recognized, right? So when he talks about the idea that maybe he's being wiretapped by Barack Obama, well, the evidence for that, the concrete evidence, is pretty darn slender. However, I think Americans in general are very worried about the idea that our intelligence agencies are unaccountable. And they are unaccountable, or at least they're unaccountable to us in a way that we can sort of verify is actually keeping them under wraps and under constraints. And when you have an Edward Snowden, when you have any number of other whistleblowers or leakers who reveal the extent of these spy programs, they alarm the American public. So when Donald Trump says something like that, on the one hand, the evidence for his actual claim is pretty much non-existent, but then the larger social truth that his claim is taking advantage of, the dwindling, well, in some cases, justified paranoia that Americans have about the scope of our intelligence capabilities. Our intelligence agencies are not, going through your mail because they want to find out, that you're cheating on your wife or something like that. They're going through your mail simply because they're trying to scan all of it to see if there's any reference to Al-Qaeda or something that could be a terrorist operation. Nevertheless, they are, sort of sweeping up all data. They stockpile the data, and there are ways in which, data that are collected for national security purposes do in fact wind up getting used for law enforcement purposes and other things. So I think when Trump says some of these things that are sort of nonsensical on the face of it, he actually is expressing something that is part of not only the American people's psyche, but also his own psyche as well. As far as anti-intellectualism goes, there too, I think there's a connection between Trump and the public. And I think it's again, I would go back to remarks I made much earlier, which is that it's not just that the public doesn't like intellectuals. It's not just that someone like Donald Trump is expected to kind of make fun of them and put them in their place. It's that the intellectuals really have done a bad job of serving the American public for quite a long time now. And even though the connection between the discontent and the way people respond to this discontent is not necessarily the logical form that we would like it to have, it's nonetheless a truth that has to be recognized, that there is this breakdown of respect on both sides. And I place more of the blame on the intellectuals, because the intellectuals are sophisticated enough that they should be able to understand what's happening and respond to it. And generally they have not. Generally they have failed. Generally they have pursued the same policies unto the point of self-destruction and destruction of the rest of the sort of middle class of the country under Republicans, under Democrats, et cetera. They simply do not want to recognize the failures of our foreign policy, the failures of our economic policy, the fact that our social approach works very well for the elite, doesn't work very well for black Americans, does not work very well for middle Americans, for people in Appalachia. So we have a ruling class, I think, that's become very detached from the public, and anti-intellectualism is in some ways a justified response to that.
Now, I don't really disagree with anything Daniel just said there, but I will just add that the mainstream right, or the conservative movement's relationship with intellectuals has always been inconsistent, I guess. Conservatism is almost by definition an elitist movement. It has always had a sort of a distrust for the so-called masses. And yet at the same time, although describing themselves as at least theoretically elitists, they don't much care for the actual existing elites who would presumably be in charge if this was a sort of a more technocratic society. William F. Buckley quite famously said that he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names of the Boston phone book than by the faculty of Harvard. He never really was able to figure out exactly what role the elite should play in conservatism and by extension in American life. And I think his failure to complete the book that was supposed to be his great contribution to political theory, a book that was supposed to be called The Revolt Against the Masses, he got about 10,000 words into it and just gave up. He couldn't complete it. And as far as I can tell, no mainstream important conservative intellectual has yet been able to really figure out where it stands on sort of the intellectual question. So I wouldn't fault Trump too much for not getting it necessarily that much better than some of his predecessors.
Okay, Alex.
Hi, Alex Wong, recent CLA alum. So looking ahead to 2020 and bringing up some thoughts that you'd actually just mentioned, talking about the polarization, in not so many words. Do you think the party that wins 2020 will be the one that's able to rebound from this polarization and tap into the more centralized thought process of the masses?
It depends on what you mean by polarization, because when we think about things like policy preferences, the United States is not really polarized. In this, I am in total agreement with Morris Fiorina of Stanford. That is, if you're looking across what people actually want government to do, Republicans and Democrats are not that far apart. So that, I guess we can take as being somewhat heartening. It's not heartening if you are a doctrinaire, a conservative or libertarian, to know that sort of the mainstream, most Americans believe in some form of welfare capitalism, but that's the reality of it. The more concerning issue is this attitudinal polarization. That is, Republicans and Democrats don't disagree with each other on that much, but they do intensely dislike each other. There's been some interesting work on that by a scholar named Liliana Mason a few years ago that demonstrated this. And how you get rid of that, that strikes me as a lot more tricky, especially as we're entering, as the age of identity politics is continuing and looks like it's not going to go away anytime soon. I don't think 2020 is going to be the year where we all once again come together, if there was ever such a time where that was the case.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mark.
The transition from the Roman Republic to the empire is often told as a tale of political forces and wealth and power and influence that emerge in the process of building the Republican control of the imperial spaces that exceeded the institutions of the Republic to control them. So when Pompey the Great comes back from Syria with more wealth than anyone in Rome has ever seen, Pompey the Great is greater than the whole of the Senate combined. And when Caesar comes down from Gaul with the same, and is able to provide farms for tens of thousands of his soldiers, you have forces that are present within the system that the institutions of the Republic can no longer contain and channel in Republican ways. This year, in 2016, we had the current representative of House Clinton, a sort of independent operation with its own little foundation, bringing in literally hundreds of millions of dollars in donations independently into their personal control on the one side. On the other side, you had a self-funding billionaire with extraordinary name recognition through celebrity. And there was a moment in the election where Michael Bloomberg was said to be considering it run as an independent. And it occurred to me at the time that if it in fact came down to a three-way race between Clinton, Trump, and Bloomberg, then we would know that the institutions of the Republic hadn't held. And in fact, there were new forces at work in the system that could not be contained. And so my question is, should we be worried about that?
That's a great question to end on.
I guess my response is that we have one bit of data from last year that suggests otherwise. We did see the perhaps final defeat of the Bush dynasty. So in some sense, you could say that Trump it was actually contrary to the narrative that you just described, though I'll let Daniel.
Well, so Mark and I had actually been discussing this before the panel, and I think his response to that would be, yes, on the one hand, the Clinton and Bush dynasties suffered big setbacks. Maybe Chelsea's going to come back at some point, but for the time being, it seems as if the Bushes are down and out. On the other hand, Trump seems to have just as much of a dynastic impulse. So Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner have an enormous amount of power within the administration. It's not out of the realm of possibility that you would see Eric Trump or Donald Trump Jr. Running for office at some point. So I do see the fear about dynastic politics, and I do see the concern that great fortunes are going to overawe the republic. I think that's always something small r Republicans have to be worried about. However, I would add that there was a dimension to what was happening in the late Roman Republic that we do not see yet, which is namely that military power was outside of the control of the Senate. That when you had a great leader who had secured his victories, therefore he not only had the money to pay his troops, but he had the troops themselves. And those troops could overawe any authority that was merely spiritual that the Senate might try to wield. We don't have that situation yet. However, that is my single greatest concern. When you look at polling of the American institutions and which institutions Americans have the most respect for, which ones they actually admire and look up to, what is the #1 most popular institution? It's certainly not the presidency. About half the country hates the president at any given time. It certainly is not Congress, which commands even less legitimacy. About maybe a third of the public, if Congress is lucky, likes what Congress is doing. And oftentimes that number falls into the single digits, which when you think about it, is a very alarming development for a representative system of government, because the whole point is we're meant to be able to look at our representation and say this is a reflection of our country. If we're looking at our representation saying this does not reflect us, then it's not representative and we are not a representative nation anymore. So that I worry about with the fall of Congress and legislative government. The president is not doing it. The Supreme Court is actually somewhat more popular with the public than either the president or the Congress, which is kind of interesting and maybe counterintuitive, especially to conservatives. But by far, and then you can look at private organizations as well. You can look at journalists. Are journalists really respected? Are they beloved by the public? Not at all. You can look at our churches. Do people look at our churches and say, these are the most important institutions in America, these are the institutions we trust to guide our society? Well, they, I think, poll rather more favorably than most of the politicians and journalists, but they still aren't at the very top. The single institution that Americans have the greatest respect for, the one they admire the most, is the armed forces. Now, our armed forces are very much under the control and completely responsive to our democratic institutions, our Republican institutions. But if anything were ever to sever the relationship between the armed forces and those democratic institutions, if ever it came down to a question of, are you with the military or are you with Congress? Are you with the military or with the president who's just from one particular party? My guess is that many people would say, we're with the generals. And if you look at the number of generals who serve in the Trump administration right now, there are a little bit of grounds for concern there as well. This idea that, well, our political leaders have failed. The people who have not failed are going to be these military leaders. Therefore, we're going to fill our government with them, and they're going to be the ones we trust to run things. Now, I actually see a kind of inoculation taking place, and I think there is a degree of healthiness to what Trump has done in this sense. Once you start putting generals in political roles, you're going to find out that generals perform as poorly in those roles as politicians do. So that, I think, will perhaps help debunk some of the mystique of a guy like General Petraeus, for example, or any number of other military leaders. But in the long run, I worry about that a great deal. I think that, and even the creation of the all-volunteer force, which was a good thing in my opinion, does have this negative that it creates the idea that these are individuals who are above the average run of humanity, above the average run of citizenship, and that serving in the military is not something that every ordinary Joe has to do. It's something that only the elect, only the really best of the best do. And that is healthy in some regards. It gives us a very competent, powerful military, but it also gives us a military that many of us are inclined to say, these people are the natural aristocrats, and they should perhaps be the ones calling the shots.
Last question, Sierra.
I was just wondering, I'm Sierra, I'm a CLA alum as well. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the idea that, well, maybe polarization is happening within the government and with our elected officials, but maybe in the American public, polarization takes the form of like cultural and social polarization. This idea that maybe people are self-sorting into geographic areas based on who thinks like them, who looks like them, and how this may be contributing to an idea of a partisan realignment.
Well, I mean, your question is one that was addressed initially by Bill Bishop in his book, The Big Sort. My own, this is actually the subject of my doctoral dissertation. So my own view, looking at the data, is that a lot of people like Bishop who said, oh, look, we see the proliferation of landslide red counties and landslide blue counties as a sign that Republicans and Democrats are deliberately moving away from each other. The evidence of deliberate geographic partisan sorting, that is, people trying to get away from people who vote differently than them, the evidence for that is not great, or at least the number of people who are actually doing that and thinking that way is fairly small. But there are all of these other variables that are correlated with our vote choice, things like race, ethnicity, religion, types of industries that we work in, that play from what I can tell, a much stronger role in geographic sorting patterns. And so this notion that we're moving apart from each other politically is something that has been happening, but it's not as much because we can't stand each other. It's in a sense partially coincident. That doesn't mean that it's not problematic, but I worry that people like Bishop and others who were looking at those same data were a bit hyperbolic. I am less concerned about that than many others.
Well, George has a very authoritative understanding of this issue, and I'm glad to hear him say that, because it's my own sort of intuitive thought has been much along those lines. But of course, you hear not only do scholars promulgate a, as you've mentioned, kind of exaggerated interpretation here, but then it gets picked up by journalists who simplify it and exaggerate it further, and then it becomes a kind of a fact of the mind, if not a fact of reality. My thought is that one reason you do see a certain degree of cultural polarization, in a variety of aspects, is because politics itself has been neutered. That instead of having sort of direct and honest political clashes, we now have a political leadership in both the Republican and the Democratic parties, which tends to agree on very big picture questions. So, for example, until very, very recently, free trade enjoyed a great deal of support in both parties. Immigration policy, for all that it seems to be a hot button, in fact, there was kind of a de facto consensus, which was we're either going to have an amnesty and have something close to open borders, which legally speaking was something that was difficult to do. No one wanted to actually take the risk of passing it. But we could have a de facto open borders. We could just not have a great deal of enforcement. We could just let kind of nature take its turn by having the illegal immigrant populations come in and increase and so forth. So there too, I think the American public, increasingly, I think, has felt detached from very big picture questions about economics and about the sort of national sovereignty, about our role in the world militarily, about our control of our own borders, et cetera. And this all exists at a very deep psychological level. And when you feel the powerlessness that comes from not having a say in these questions that are sort of determinative for the health of the republic, I think you then wind up having to channel your energies into other things, into debates that cannot possibly be resolved about race and religion and so forth. No matter how much you argue with someone, you're obviously not going to change their race. You're not going to, you're probably not going to change their religion just through argument. Maybe through grace, but not through just pure reason. And if you're arguing to change someone's sexuality or whatever, that too is probably not going to get very far. So these kinds of arguments, I think, are static. They're things that people can passionately invest in and feel as if they must fight and win, but that actually cannot be fought and cannot be won. Whereas political battles can be fought and can be won. You actually can adopt one trade policy or another. You actually can adopt one foreign policy or another. You actually can adopt various different tax schemes and so forth. But that requires a more responsive political class in both parties, one that's actually willing to draw distinctions and to have a direct combat that I think we were not seeing in the eras of the Bushes and Clintons. Just think about the extent to which neoliberalism and globalization was the creed of both the George H.W. administration, the Bill Clinton administration, and the George W. Bush administration, and also to some degree, to a large degree in fact, the Barack Obama administration. I think that's what's created an opening for other kinds of divisions, and that if we are able to get back to serious political divisions and a serious sense of conflicting policies at the deepest economic levels, then we may see some of these cultural questions assume their proper proportions, which is not to dominate everything, but to be a kind of limited part of politics, even if they're a large part of individual life.
I see somebody who'd really like to ask a question. This must be the last question, and if it can be handled succinctly, sir.
I'm Stanley Dole, a resident of Beacon Hill Retirement Community. I would like a little different perspective on this versus the concept of conservative versus liberal, thinking a little bit about the issue of freedom versus control. We have now been here for 250 years in this country, and every time there's some problem, we pass another law or another regulation, and it builds and it builds and it builds. Most of the rest of the world has a revolution and they kill off the king or something, they start all over again. I think part of this Trump situation is trying to do that. It's better to do it that way than to have a revolution. But the whole concept of freedom, in other words, in bringing up like discrimination, for instance, I ought to be, if I'm a true believer in freedom and I'm an employer, I ought to be able to say, well, I'm not going to hire that person because of their religion, their race, their sexuality, their politics, or whatever. But then I argue with justice. We shouldn't judge people. Everybody should be equal and have the equal rights to be hired and so forth. So I might just comment a little bit about whether some of this stuff is freedom or control, or whether it's conservative and liberal.
Well, thank you. We will handle that question briefly.
This is in terms of political taxonomies, you'll often hear, particularly from libertarians, the notion that we should think of the ideological spectrum as being one that runs from liberty on one side, perhaps anarchy being at the extreme end, and totalitarianism being at the other. And my problem with that is the way people will be distributed along that line is going to be very heavily towards the statist side. That is, if you're looking for a distribution of people, people tend to like the state. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but if you're saying, okay, well, you have libertarians here and everyone else over there, I don't really like a taxonomy in which one of the two poles has such a tiny percentage of people. And I do think we can make distinctions between different types of statism. I mean, it is a nice rhetorical trick if you're on the right to say that the left includes all authoritarian and totalitarian governments. That way you can say that both Pol Pot and Hitler were leftists. I think that's incorrect, or at least, if not incorrect, I think it oversimplifies different varieties of big government.
Thank you.
Well, and I think the question got at something very important, which is, as you take cultural differences, which, while they remain simply in the realm of culture, are just differences people can sort out in humane ways as common friends or family members or simply neighbors. Once you politicize certain differences, once you get government involved, once you remove the question from the realm of freedom and culture and place it into the realm of policy and power, then you can have a chain reaction and a vicious circle can emerge. So, for example, just think about this. You know, we're all accustomed to eating whatever we want to eat. We eat, you know, our families might have their rules, our religious groups might have their rules, but we basically all decide, you know, within our own households or for ourselves as individuals, what we're going to eat. Now imagine that we had a system where we all had a common mess hall, and it had to serve everyone. You can see that suddenly political questions would arise. You know, are you going to serve shellfish? Are you going to serve bacon? Are you going to serve enough fish on Friday? There could be any number of questions which right now are not political problems at all, which would suddenly become very complicated political problems if power expanded to the point where government was providing our meals for us. And you can see that when you try to solve these problems by then negotiating you know, sort of carve-outs for different groups, when you say like, well, okay, we're now going to have non-discrimination laws that are going to apply to this group but not that group. Well, then the group it doesn't apply to is going to say, wait a minute, that's not fair to us. We should get that as well. Okay, so now you have non-discrimination laws applying not only to a race but also to a sexuality. Well, now you might have a religious group say, wait a minute, the way these laws are now being applied to us because of the sexuality expansion is causing problems for us, and it's limiting our freedom. So now government has to get involved again and make yet another intervention and yet another set of laws in order to complicate the picture further and sort of try to each time restore some freedom that had been lost simply by getting government involved in the first place. So in that sense, I really do favor a pretty small state and politicizing as few questions as possible. Because I think once you start, it gets very hard to de-escalate the arms race. That politicization then takes on a momentum of its own, and both the left and the right then engage in it.
Thank you very much. Let's give our conversationalists a hand.